Most importantly, she forced herself to adopt the distant politeness that white society expected between races, suppressing every instinct that wanted to stay close to Nathan's side. When the cavalry patrol finally crested the ridge and rode down toward the halted caravan, they found what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary trading expedition taking a rest break in the desert heat. Miguel Santos stood beside his lead wagon with the easy confidence of a man whose paperwork was in order, while his diverse crew of employees and guards went about their business with professional efficiency. The patrol's leader was a young lieutenant whose polished appearance and nervous energy marked him as new to the frontier. He rode directly to Miguel with the kind of aggressive confidence that often masked inexperience, his hand resting ostentatiously on his saber hilt. "Miguel Santos," the lieutenant asked, his voice carrying the clipped accent of East Coast privilege. When Lieutenant Coleman finally approached, Nathan Isabella's hands clenched into fists, so tight that her nails drew blood from her palms. This was the moment of ultimate test. Could Nathan's disguise withstand close scrutiny from a trained army officer? "You," Coleman said, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man addressing a social inferior. "What's your name?" "Joe Crow Feather," Nathan replied, his voice taking on the slight accent and simplified grammar that whites expected from Apache guides. "I scout for Mr. Santos. Know this country well. Help find safe paths through Apache lands." "How long have you worked for Santos?" "2 seasons now. Good man, pay fair wages. Better than reservation life, better than running in mountains." Coleman's eyes narrowed slightly, and Isabella held her breath as the young officer studied Nathan's face with obvious suspicion. "You look familiar," he said slowly. "Have we met before?" "All Apache look same to white eyes," Nathan replied with just the right note of resigned acceptance. "Maybe you see my cousin who works for cavalry as scout. Many say we have similar faces." It was a masterful response, acknowledging the similarity while providing a plausible explanation that played into white prejudices about Apache appearance. Coleman's expression relaxed slightly, his suspicion apparently satisfied by the explanation. "Where is Nathan Blackhawk now?" the lieutenant asked, suddenly clearly testing Nathan's reaction to the name. Nathan shrugged with convincing indifference. "Bad Apache cause trouble for all Apache," he said. "I hear he may be dead, maybe hiding in Mexico. Not my concern. I just want honest work, stay out of trouble." Coleman stared at him for another long moment, then turned away with obvious frustration. "Sergeant Williams, continue the search. Check every wagon, every pack. If Blackhawk is here, I want him found." In their haste to escape the trader camp, Nathan had brought the stolen mount along rather than risk leaving evidence of their passage. Lieutenant Coleman's face went white with rage as he recognized the animal. "That's Corporal Henderson's horse from B Troop," he snarled, his hand flying to his pistol. "Where did you get this animal?" Miguel's expression remained perfectly calm, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders as he weighed his response. "Found him wandering loose yesterday morning," he said finally. "No rider, no tack, just a lone horse in the desert. Apache country is hard on travelers, figured someone had bad luck." "Where exactly did you find this horse?" Coleman demanded, his voice rising with each word. "About 10 miles north of here," Miguel replied smoothly. "Near Skeleton Creek. My men brought him in rather than leave him for the coyotes." It was a plausible story, the kind of thing that happened regularly in the harsh Arizona desert. But Isabella could see that Coleman wasn't buying it completely. The young officer's inexperience was balanced by a suspicious nature that made him dangerous in ways that a more seasoned commander might not be. "Sergeant Williams," Coleman ordered, "take 3 men and ride to Sergeant O'Malley's last known position. I want to know what happened to B Troop, and I want to know now." Isabella exchanged a desperate glance with Nathan, seeing her own fear reflected in his carefully controlled expression. If the patrol found O'Malley and his men, if they learned about the previous night's encounter, it would only be a matter of time before the truth came out. But there was nothing they could do now except wait and hope that Sergeant O'Malley would honor his promise to keep their secret. Their fate was no longer in their own hands. It rested with a gruff Irish soldier who had chosen mercy over duty in a moment of supreme moral courage. In the meantime, Coleman continued, his eyes sweeping over the assembled traders with renewed suspicion. Nobody leaves this spot. We're going to wait right here until I get answers about that horse and what happened to my men. Miguel nodded with apparent cooperation, but Isabella could see the calculation in his weathered features. The trader was weighing his options, considering how long he could maintain this charade before the risks became too great for his operation. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky as they waited, the heat becoming oppressive as it reflected off the surrounding rocks and sand. The soldiers maintained their vigilance with professional discipline, but Isabella could see the strain beginning to show in their faces as the hours passed without word from their missing comrades. Nathan remained in character with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting, but Isabella could sense the coiled tension in his muscles, the readiness to explode into action if their disguise finally failed. He was like a mountain cat preparing to spring, every sense attuned to the slightest sign of danger. It was nearly noon when the sound of approaching hoofbeats finally broke the oppressive silence. Sergeant Williams and his men appeared on the horizon, riding hard toward the caravan with the urgency that spoke of important news. Isabella felt her mouth go dry as she prepared for the worst. Lieutenant Coleman strode forward to meet his returning sergeant, his young face tight with anticipation. "Report, Sergeant, what did you find?" Williams dismounted with obvious reluctance, his weathered face grim, as he struggled to find the right words. "Sir, we found Sergeant O'Malley's patrol about 15 miles northeast of here. They're all alive and accounted for, but what, Sergeant? Spit it out." "But they claim they never encountered any Apache, sir. Never saw hide nor hair of Nathan Blackhawk or anyone else. They've been patrolling the Mogollon Rim for the past 3 days without incident." Isabella nearly sobbed with relief as she realized what had happened. O'Malley had kept his word, had convinced his men to maintain the fiction that would protect Nathan and herself. The gruff Irish sergeant had chosen honor over ambition, mercy over military advancement. Lieutenant Coleman's face cycled through a series of expressions: confusion, frustration, and finally resigned acceptance. Without evidence of Apache activity in the area, without any concrete proof that Nathan Blackhawk had been anywhere near the caravan, he had no legal justification for continuing his harassment of Miguel's legitimate business operation. "All right," he said finally, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "False alarm, apparently. You're free to continue your journey, Santos, but I'll be watching your operation closely from now on." "Of course, Lieutenant," Miguel replied with diplomatic grace, "always happy to cooperate with the Army in maintaining peace and order in the territory." As the cavalry patrol finally rode away, leaving the caravan alone in the vast desert silence, Isabella felt as though she could finally breathe again. They had survived another test, had passed through the fire once more without being consumed, but she knew that their luck could not hold forever, that each encounter brought them closer to the moment when their disguises would finally fail. "That was closer than I'd like," Miguel said quietly as his men began preparing for departure. "Much closer. You two bring more trouble than you're worth, even at $500. "We understand the risks we're asking you to take," Nathan replied, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. "And we will not forget your courage in helping us." Miguel studied them both for a long moment, his shrewd eyes taking in the obvious bond between them and the determination that drove their unlikely partnership. "Just remember your promise about the evidence at Skull Canyon," he said finally. "If you're lying to me about that, if this is all some elaborate Apache revenge scheme, I'll hunt you down myself and collect that bounty." 3 days, Nathan assured him. And Miguel, when you see what we've uncovered, you'll understand why this journey is worth any risk. As the caravan resumed its westward trek, Isabella found herself looking back toward the distant mountains where their adventure had begun. They were leaving behind everything familiar, everything safe, venturing into an uncertain future that promised either triumph or disaster, with no middle ground between. But as Nathan's hand found hers beneath the canvas covering of their wagon, she felt a surge of confidence that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, and somehow that made even the impossible seem achievable. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a harsh landscape that had claimed countless lives, but also offered the promise of transformation for those brave enough to embrace its challenges. In its vastness, two fugitive souls had found each other and forged a love that defied every convention of their divided world. Now they rode toward their destiny, carrying with them the hope that justice might yet triumph over greed, that love could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships could change the course of history itself. Réessayer T.S. Part 5. Louis Viet T5 nhanh chăm dần từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phu phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, dòng văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết, lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau Modifier Part 5. The outskirts of Tucson rose from the desert heat, like a fever dream, its adobe buildings shimmering in the late afternoon sun as Miguel's caravan crested the final ridge. Isabella felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she gazed down at the bustling frontier town that would either mark the next stage of their journey or become the place where their desperate flight finally ended. The streets teemed with life miners heading to the saloons after long shifts, merchants hawking their wares, soldiers on leave from the nearby fort, and the inevitable collection of drifters and fortune seekers that gravitated toward any settlement in the territory. "This is where we part ways," Miguel said as the caravan rolled to a stop in the dusty yard behind Henderson's trading post. "The stage to California leaves at dawn tomorrow, assuming you can secure passage without drawing unwanted attention." Nathan helped Isabella down from the wagon, his touch lingering for just a moment longer than necessary as their eyes met. 3 days of enforced separation, of pretending to be nothing more than employer and guide, had been torture for both of them. The need to maintain their disguise had created a distance that felt more painful than any physical wound. "The remaining payment," Nathan said, pressing a leather pouch into Miguel's weathered hands, "with our gratitude for your discretion." Miguel weighed the pouch with practiced efficiency, then nodded his satisfaction. "You've been good customers," he admitted grudgingly, "but I hope our paths don't cross again anytime soon. You two attract trouble like honey draws flies." As the trader and his men prepared to depart for their next destination, Isabella found herself struggling with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Miguel Santos had risked his entire operation to help them reach Tucson safely, but now they were on their own in a town crawling with potential enemies. Every face in the crowd could belong to a bounty hunter. Every soldier could be the one who finally recognized Nathan's carefully disguised features. "We need to find lodging for the night," Nathan said quietly as they gathered their few possessions. "Somewhere we can rest and plan our next move without attracting attention." Isabella nodded, her eyes scanning the busy street for any sign of immediate danger. "The Territorial Hotel looks respectable enough," she suggested, pointing to a 2-story building with fresh paint and clean windows. "The kind of place where questions aren't asked if the payment is good." They made their way through the crowded streets with careful nonchalance, Nathan maintaining his role as a hired guide while Isabella played the part of a traveling woman of modest means. It was a performance that had served them well during the journey from the Hidden Valley, but Isabella could feel the strain beginning to show in the tension around Nathan's eyes and the careful way he held his shoulders. The hotel clerk was a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of pale complexion that spoke of too many hours spent in poorly lit rooms. He looked up from his ledger as they approached his watery eyes, taking in their travel-worn appearance with obvious assessment. "We need 2 rooms for the night," Isabella said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of a woman accustomed to getting her way. "Something clean and quiet away from the street noise. 2 rooms." The clerk repeated, his gaze flicking between Isabella and Nathan with poorly concealed curiosity. "You're traveling together. This man is my guide," Isabella replied smoothly, her voice carrying just the right note of aristocratic disdain. "I'm traveling to California on family business, and he was recommended as someone who knows the territory well." The explanation seemed to satisfy the clerk's curiosity, though Isabella could see him making mental notes about their arrangement. In frontier society, it wasn't unusual for wealthy women to employ local guides for protection during dangerous journeys, but the relationship was always viewed with suspicion by those who made their living from gossip and speculation. "That'll be $4, the clerk said, sliding 2 keys across the scarred wooden counter. "Rooms 12 and 14 second floor. Meals are served in the dining room until 9 o'clock. As they climbed the narrow staircase to their rooms, Isabella felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. The past week had been a whirlwind of danger, deception, and emotional upheaval that had left her feeling drained in ways she had never experienced before. All she wanted was a few hours of safety, a chance to rest and gather her strength for whatever challenges lay ahead. Her room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. Isabella set down her small bundle of possessions and moved to the window, watching the ebb and flow of human activity below, while her mind struggled to process everything that had brought her to this moment. A soft knock at her door brought her back to the present. She opened it to find Nathan standing in the hallway, his dark eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of potential threats before he stepped into her room and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. "About what happens next, about the risks we're taking by continuing this journey together." Isabella felt her heart sink as she recognized the tone in his voice. It was the same careful, measured cadence he had used in the Hidden Valley when he had tried to convince her to return to her former life. "You're having second thoughts," she said, though it came out as more of an accusation than a question. "I'm having realistic thoughts," Nathan replied, moving to the window to check the street below before turning back to face her. "Isabella, what we've accomplished so far has been nothing short of miraculous. We've escaped certain death, evaded capture by the army, and made it this far without either of us ending up dead or in chains. But our luck cannot hold forever." "So you want to quit?" Isabella asked, her voice sharp with the pain of impending abandonment. "You want to give up on everything we've discovered, everything we've promised to expose?" Nathan's expression softened, and he took a step toward her before catching himself. "I want you to be safe," he said quietly. "I want you to have a chance at the life you deserve, even if that life doesn't include me." Isabella felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, but she forced them back through sheer will. "And what about the life I want?" she demanded. "What about the choice I made to stand with you against the whole world? Does that mean nothing to you?" "It means everything to me," Nathan said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "It means so much that I'm willing to sacrifice my own happiness to ensure your safety. Isabella, tomorrow morning you can board that stage to San Francisco and disappear into a new life. You can become anyone you want to be, do anything you want to do without the burden of a wanted Apache warrior dragging you down." "And you?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. What happens to Nathan Blackhawk when I disappear into my new life? Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of responsibilities and sacrifices that had shaped his entire existence. I go back to the fight, he said simply. I find Cornelius Blackwood and make him pay for the innocent blood on his hands. With or without evidence, with or without help, I see justice done. Isabella stared at him in horrified disbelief. You're talking about suicide, she said flatly. You're talking about throwing your life away on a mission that you can't possibly complete alone. Perhaps, Nathan admitted, but it would be an honorable death, one that might inspire others to continue the fight for justice. Sometimes that's all a warrior can offer, his life in service of a cause greater than himself. The casual way he spoke of his own death, the resigned acceptance in his voice, triggered something fierce and protective in Isabella's heart. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grabbed his face in both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Listen to me, Nathan Blackhawk, she said, her voice trembling with intensity. I didn't survive everything we've been through just to watch you throw your life away on some misguided notion of honor. We started this journey together, and we're going to finish it together. That's not a request, it's a fact. Nathan's hands came up to cover hers, his dark eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. Isabella. He whispered her name, carrying all the love and longing he had been fighting to suppress. You don't understand what you're asking. The path ahead of us leads only to more danger, more death, more impossible choices. I can't ask you to— You're not asking, Isabella interrupted, her voice fierce with determination. I'm choosing. I'm choosing love over safety, justice over comfort, truth over the lies that our society tells itself. And I'm choosing you, Nathan Blackhawk, for better or worse, until death parts us. The words hung between them like a sacred vow, and Isabella could see the moment when Nathan's careful control finally shattered. He pulled her into his arms with desperate hunger, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of salt tears and unspoken promises. All the barriers that duty and circumstance had erected between them crumbled in that moment, leaving only the raw truth of 2 souls recognizing their perfect match. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their hearts hammering in dangerous synchronization. Nathan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if he were offering a prayer to whatever spirits watched over star-crossed lovers. If we do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, if we continue this journey together, there truly will be no going back. Once we reach San Francisco, once we begin the fight against Blackwood in earnest, we become something that neither of our peoples will understand or accept. Then we'll create a new people, Isabella replied, her voice steady with conviction. A people who believe in justice regardless of skin color, and love that transcends the artificial barriers that society creates. We'll be the bridge your father wanted you to become, but we'll build it together. Nathan's smile was like the sunrise breaking over the desert mountains, brilliant, warming, and full of promise despite the dangers that lay ahead. Together, he repeated, as if the word were a talisman against all the forces arrayed against them. They spent the evening planning their approach to the challenges that awaited them in San Francisco, poring over the intelligence Nathan had gathered about Cornelius Blackwood's operations and the political landscape they would need to navigate. Isabella's knowledge of her uncle's business connections proved invaluable as they identified potential allies and enemies within the city's complex social hierarchy. Blackwood has been building his empire for years, Nathan explained as they studied a hand-drawn map of the railroad baron's known holdings. He owns politicians, judges, newspaper editors, anyone who might pose a threat to his operations. Taking him down will require more than evidence. It will require a carefully orchestrated campaign that destroys his credibility and turns his own allies against him. My Uncle Harold has been fighting the Central Pacific's monopolistic practices for years, Isabella added, her finger tracing the rail lines that connected Blackwood's various enterprises. He represents several shipping companies that have been squeezed out by railroad consolidation. If we can provide him with the evidence he needs, he might be willing to take on Blackwood in court. And if legal channels fail? Nathan asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Isabella's jaw tightened with resolve. Then we find other ways to ensure that justice is served. Blackwood has declared war on innocent people. We simply ensure that the war comes to his doorstep instead of theirs. They talked late into the night, their voices growing softer as exhaustion finally began to claim them. But neither wanted to break the spell of intimacy that had settled over them, the sense that they were no longer two separate people, but halves of a single purpose. When Isabella finally fell asleep curled against Nathan's chest, like a trusting child, he remained awake for a long time afterward. His warrior's instincts were screaming warnings about the dangers that lay ahead, about the impossibility of the task they had set for themselves. But every time doubt threatened to overwhelm him, he looked down at the woman in his arms and felt his resolve strengthen. Isabella Martinez had chosen him over safety, had chosen their mission over the comfortable life she could have had in San Francisco society. The least he could do was prove himself worthy of such faith, worthy of such love. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the bustle and noise of a frontier town coming to life. Isabella woke to find Nathan already dressed and standing by the window, his body tense with the alertness of a man who never truly relaxed. "The stage leaves in an hour," he said without turning around, "but we may have a problem." Isabella joined him at the window, following his gaze to the street below, where a familiar figure was emerging from the sheriff's office. Lieutenant Coleman, still wearing his dusty cavalry uniform, was engaged in animated conversation with a man wearing a tin star and the kind of hard expression that marked him as someone not to be trifled with. "He's not giving up," Isabella observed, her heart sinking as she watched the young officer point in the direction of their hotel. "He knows we're here." "Or he suspects it," Nathan corrected. "But suspicion is not proof, and we still have the advantage of surprise. He's looking for Nathan Blackhawk and Isabella Martinez, not for the characters we've created." Isabella nodded, understanding immediately what he meant. Their disguises had served them well during the journey from the trading camp, but now they would need to take the deception even further. They would need to become completely different people, at least until they could board the stage and escape Coleman's jurisdiction. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, already moving toward her small bundle of possessions. "Become someone else." Nathan replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had made peace with desperate choices. "Become someone that Lieutenant Coleman would never think to look for." The transformation that followed was remarkable in its thoroughness. Isabella bound her breasts and cut her hair short, adopting the appearance of a young man traveling west to seek his fortune in the gold fields. Nathan's own metamorphosis was equally dramatic. Gone was the proud Apache warrior, replaced by a weathered Mexican vaquero, whose accent and mannerism spoke of years spent working cattle ranches across the border. When they finally descended to the hotel lobby, they were no longer Nathan Blackhawk and Isabella Martinez, but rather Carlos Mendoza and his young nephew Miguel, traveling to California in search of work. Their Spanish was flawless, their accents authentic, and their backstory simple enough to withstand casual scrutiny. The stage station was crowded with travelers, all eager to escape the growing tensions in Arizona territory for the promise of opportunity in California. Isabella, now Miguel, kept her head down and her voice soft as Nathan purchased their tickets, paying the fare with coins that showed no trace of their Apache origins. Lieutenant Coleman was there, she noticed, with a chill of fear, his pale eyes scanning every face in the crowd with the intensity of a hunting hawk. He was accompanied by the local sheriff and 2 deputies, all of them armed and obviously prepared for trouble. Ladies and gentlemen, the stage driver called out, his voice carrying over the general hubbub. California stage departing in 10 minutes. All aboard who's going aboard. Isabella felt her heart hammering as they joined the line of passengers preparing to board. This was the moment of ultimate test. If their disguises failed now, if Coleman recognized them despite all their precautions, it would all be over. Papers, one of the deputies said as they reached the front of the line. Need to see identification and travel documents. Nathan handed over the carefully forged papers that Miguel Santos had provided as part of their payment documents that identified them as Mexican nationals traveling on legitimate business. The deputy studied them with the bored efficiency of a man going through routine motions, his eyes barely registering the faces that went with the names. Purpose of travel, he asked mechanically. Seeking work in the vineyards of California, Nathan replied in accented English, his entire demeanor that of a humble laborer hoping for nothing more than honest employment. My nephew, he has letters from family already there. The deputy nodded and handed back their papers, already turning his attention to the next passenger in line. Isabella nearly sobbed with relief as they climbed into the stage, taking their seats among the collection of miners, merchants, and adventurers who made up their traveling companions. Through the window, she could see Lieutenant Coleman growing increasingly frustrated as passenger after passenger passed inspection without incident. He was certain that his quarry was somewhere in the crowd, but his eyes passed over them without recognition, seeing only what their disguises allowed him to see. The stage lurched into motion with a crack of the driver's whip, and Isabella felt a surge of triumph as Tucson began to fall away behind them. They had done it. They had escaped the net that Coleman had tried to cast around them, had slipped through his fingers like smoke in the desert wind. But their celebration was short-lived. As the stage rounded a bend in the road, Isabella caught sight of a dust cloud on the horizon, riders moving fast in their direction. Coleman might have lost them in town, but he wasn't giving up the chase. We have company, Nathan murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear it. Military patrol moving to intercept. Isabella's mouth went dry as she realized what this meant. Their disguises might have fooled a cursory inspection, but they wouldn't survive detailed scrutiny from trained investigators. If Coleman managed to stop the stage and conduct a thorough search, their true identities would be exposed within minutes. What do we do? She whispered, her hands clenched into fists to hide their trembling. Nathan's eyes never left the approaching riders as he considered their options. They were trapped in a moving box with innocent passengers facing trained cavalry soldiers on open ground where concealment was impossible. By all military logic, their situation was hopeless. We trust in the spirits, Nathan said, finally, his voice carrying a calm that Isabella envied. And we remember that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most desperate circumstances. The stage driver had seen the approaching patrol as well, and he began pushing his horses harder, clearly hoping to outrun the pursuit. But cavalry mounts were bred for speed and endurance, while stage horses were selected for reliability over long distances. It was only a matter of time before the gap between them closed completely. When Lieutenant Coleman finally caught up with the fleeing stage, forcing it to halt with drawn weapons and shouted commands, Isabella felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. They had come so far, had overcome so many obstacles, had proved that love could triumph over hatred and prejudice. If this was where their journey ended, at least they would face their fate together. But as the soldiers surrounded the stage and began their search, Isabella noticed something that made her heart leap with sudden hope. The young lieutenant's attention was focused entirely on the adult passengers, his eyes scanning faces and checking papers with mechanical efficiency. He barely glanced at the slight Mexican boy who kept his head down and his mouth shut, dismissing him as too young and innocent to be of any consequence. It was the oldest mistake in the book, assuming that danger always came in expected forms, that enemies would look and act like the mental image that prejudice had created. Coleman was looking for a proud Apache warrior, and a defiant white woman not for a humble vaquero and his frightened nephew. One by one, the passengers were questioned and released, their papers inspected and their stories verified. When Coleman finally reached Nathan, Isabella held her breath and prayed to whatever spirits might be listening. Carlos Mendoza, the lieutenant read from the forged documents. Mexican national traveling to California for work. Sí, señor. Nathan replied, his voice carrying just the right note of nervous respect. I have family there. They say there is good work in the vineyards for men who are not afraid of honest labor. Coleman's eyes studied Nathan's face with obvious frustration, clearly convinced that he was missing something important, but unable to identify what it might be. This boy is your nephew. Mi sobrino Miguel, Nathan confirmed, gesturing toward Isabella with casual familiarity. Orphaned last year, I promised his mother I would take care of him. The lieutenant's gaze flicked briefly to Isabella, taking in her youthful appearance and downcast eyes before dismissing her as irrelevant. In his mind, she was just another immigrant child seeking a better life across the border, hardly the stuff of military concern. Where were you 3 days ago? Coleman asked, suddenly clearly, hoping to catch Nathan in a lie. Tubac, Nathan replied without hesitation, naming a small settlement south of Tucson. Working for Senor Rodriguez, helping with the cattle drive to market. Many people saw us there. It was a perfect answer, impossible to verify quickly, but plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiry. Coleman's frustration was evident as he handed back the papers and moved on to the next passenger, clearly convinced that his real quarry had somehow slipped through his net. When the search finally concluded without result, the lieutenant's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. He had been certain that Nathan Blackhawk was somewhere in the territory, had followed every lead and pursued every rumor with the determination of a bloodhound, but once again his quarry had vanished like a ghost. All right, he snarled to his men, mount up. We're heading back to Tucson to start over. As the cavalry patrol rode away in defeat, Isabella felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. They had survived another test, had passed through the fire once more without being consumed. But more than that, they had proved something important to themselves, that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, their determination fierce enough to triumph over any enemy. The stage resumed its journey westward, carrying them away from the dangers of Arizona territory toward the uncertain promise of California. Behind them lay a trail of close calls and narrow escapes of lives changed forever by chance encounters and desperate choices. Ahead lay San Francisco and the final confrontation with Cornelius Blackwood, the man whose greed had set their entire adventure in motion. But for now, in this moment between past and future, Isabella was content to sit beside the man she loved and watch the desert gradually give way to new landscapes, new possibilities, new hope. They had survived everything that hatred and prejudice could throw at them, had proved that love could bridge any divide and overcome any obstacle. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and somehow that made even the impossible seem not just achievable, but inevitable. The wheels of the stage turned steadily westward, carrying two fugitive hearts toward their destiny, and the promise that justice, like love, would ultimately prevail over the forces that sought to destroy it. In the vast expanse of the American frontier, where dreams and nightmares walked hand in hand, Isabella Martinez and Nathan Blackhawk had found something worth fighting for and someone worth dying for. Their story was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a love that would survive any storm and a partnership that would change the course of history itself. The San Francisco Bay emerged from the morning mist like a vision from another world, its waters sparkling with reflected sunlight, as the steamship Pacific Queen navigated through the Golden Gate toward the bustling harbor beyond. Isabella stood at the ship's rail, her heart hammering with a mixture of anticipation and terror as she gazed upon the city that would either become their sanctuary or their tomb. 3 weeks had passed since they boarded the stage in Tucson. 3 weeks of careful travel that had taken them through Los Angeles and up the California coast aboard a series of ships and wagons. Their disguises had held throughout the journey, but Isabella could feel the strain beginning to show in the tight lines around Nathan's eyes and the way his hand never strayed far from the knife hidden beneath his coat. "It's magnificent," she whispered, taking in the sight of hundreds of ships crowding the harbor, everything from Chinese junks to massive clipper ships that had sailed around Cape Horn laden with goods from the eastern seaboard. The city itself sprawled across a series of hills like a glittering jewel, its streets alive with the controlled chaos that marked it as one of the most dynamic places on Earth. Nathan joined her at the rail, his dark eyes studying the approaching cityscape with the tactical assessment of a warrior preparing for battle. "So many people," he observed quietly. "So many places to hide, but also so many eyes watching. We must be very careful here, Isabella. This city may offer us opportunity, but it also offers our enemies the same chance." The transformation from Carlos and Miguel back to their true identities had been accomplished gradually during the sea voyage, Nathan's hair returning to its natural style while Isabella reclaimed her feminine appearance. But they were no longer quite the same people who had fled through the Arizona desert weeks ago. The trials they had faced had forged them into something new, partners in every sense of the word, bound together by shared danger and unshakable trust. As the ship docked at one of the countless piers that jutted into the bay like wooden fingers, Isabella felt a thrill of recognition at the familiar sights and sounds of the city where she had spent several childhood summers. The cacophony of languages, English, Spanish, Chinese, German, Italian, created a symphony of human ambition that was unlike anywhere else in America. Here, in this melting pot of cultures and dreams, two people from different worlds might actually have a chance to build something together. "Miss Martinez." A familiar voice cut through the crowd of disembarking passengers, and Isabella turned to see a well-dressed man in his 50s approaching with obvious relief. Uncle Harold looked older than she remembered, his once dark hair, now silver at the temples, and his face marked by the lines that came from years of fighting uphill battles in the business world. "Uncle Harold," Isabella said, moving toward him with genuine warmth. "Thank you for meeting us. I wasn't sure my telegram would reach you in time." Harold Whitman embraced his niece with obvious emotion, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he held her at arm's length to study her face. "My dear girl," he said softly, "when we heard about what happened in Arizona territory, about poor Thomas and the others, we feared the worst. Your aunt has been beside herself with worry." Isabella felt a pang of guilt at the deception she was about to practice on this good man who had always been like a second father to her. But there was no choice. The truth about her relationship with Nathan would have to be revealed gradually, carefully, if it was to be revealed at all. "Uncle Harold," she said, turning toward Nathan with what she hoped was the appropriate mix of gratitude and formality. "I'd like you to meet Nathan Blackhawk. He's the man who saved my life and escorted me safely to California." Harold's expression shifted subtly as he took in Nathan's appearance, the proud bearing, the intelligent eyes, the unmistakable dignity that marked him as something more than an ordinary frontier guide. This was clearly a man of substance despite his Apache heritage, and Harold Whitman had not built his shipping empire by making snap judgments about people. "Mr. Blackhawk," Harold said, extending his hand with careful courtesy, "I'm in your debt for bringing my niece to safety. I understand the journey from Arizona was fraught with danger." Nathan shook the offered hand with firm respect, his English carrying no trace of the accent he had affected during their disguise. "Your niece is a remarkable woman, Mr. Whitman. Her courage and determination kept us both alive during some very difficult circumstances." Harold's eyebrows rose slightly at Nathan's articulate speech and refined manners, clearly revising his assumptions about what to expect from an Apache guide. "Indeed, well, you must both be exhausted from your journey. I have a carriage waiting to take us to the house where Aunt Margaret has prepared rooms for you both." As they made their way through the crowded streets of San Francisco, Isabella found herself marveling at how the city had grown since her last visit. Construction was everywhere, new buildings rising from empty lots, streets being widened to accommodate increased traffic, cable car lines being extended to serve the expanding neighborhoods that sprawled across the hills. The gold rush might be over, but the boom it had created continued to transform the city at a breathtaking pace. "The railroad has changed everything," Harold explained as their carriage navigated through the controlled chaos of Montgomery Street. "Cornelius Blackwood and his associates have been buying up vast tracts of land planning routes that will connect San Francisco to every major city in the country. The potential for profit is enormous, but so is the potential for corruption." Isabella and Nathan exchanged a meaningful glance at the mention of Blackwood's name. They had come to San Francisco with evidence of the railroad baron's crimes, but they needed to be very careful about how they presented that information. One wrong move could expose them both to deadly retaliation. "You know Blackwood personally?" Nathan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Harold's expression darkened. "I know of him, and what I know makes my blood boil. The man has been systematically destroying smaller shipping companies like mine, using his railroad monopoly to undercut our rates and drive us out of business, but that's not the worst of it. There are rumors about how he acquires the land for his rail lines that would turn your stomach." The Whitman mansion on Nob Hill was everything Isabella remembered, a testament to refined taste and quiet wealth that spoke of success achieved through honest effort rather than political manipulation. Aunt Margaret's welcome was as warm as expected, though Isabella could see the older woman's confusion about Nathan's presence and status in their traveling party. "Mr. Blackhawk will be staying in the guest quarters above the carriage house," Harold explained as they settled in the parlor for afternoon tea. "I assume you'll want to rest for a few days before making any decisions about your future plans, Isabella." "Actually, Uncle Harold," Isabella said, her voice carrying a note of determination that made both her relatives look up in surprise. "I was hoping we could discuss Cornelius Blackwood and his railroad operations. Nathan has some information that I think you'd find very interesting." Harold's attention sharpened immediately, his businessman's instincts sensing opportunity in his niece's words. "What kind of information?" Nathan leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes meeting Harold's with steady intensity. "The kind that could bring down Blackwood's entire empire if presented properly to the right people." What followed was the most delicate conversation of Isabella's life. Nathan revealed the truth about the attacks on frontier settlements, about Morrison's gang and their connection to Blackwood's land acquisition schemes, about the web of corruption that stretched from Arizona territory to the highest levels of California politics. He spoke with quiet authority, presenting facts rather than accusations, allowing Harold to draw his own conclusions about the implications. Harold Whitman was no fool. As Nathan's story unfolded, the older man's face grew increasingly grim, his hands clenching into fists as he grasped the full scope of Blackwood's crimes. "You're telling me that Cornelius Blackwood has been orchestrating the murder of innocent families to drive down land prices along his proposed rail routes. I'm telling you that Morrison and his gang were acting on orders from someone with the resources to pay them well and the influence to keep them protected from military retaliation," Nathan replied carefully. "I'm telling you that they specifically mentioned Blackwood's name before they died." "Dear God," Margaret whispered, her face pale with horror. "Harold, if this is true—" "If this is true, then we have a duty to expose him," Harold said firmly. "But we'll need more than testimony from a wanted Apache warrior to convince the authorities. Blackwood has friends in very high places, judges, politicians, newspaper editors. They'll dismiss any accusations as the desperate lies of a savage seeking revenge." "That's why we need your help," Isabella said, finally revealing the true purpose of their journey. You have connections in the business community, relationships built on trust and mutual respect. If you could convince them to listen, to examine the evidence we've gathered." Harold studied them both for a long moment, his sharp mind clearly working through the implications and potential consequences of what they were asking. "This would be incredibly dangerous," he said finally. "Blackwood doesn't just destroy his business competitors, he destroys anyone who threatens his operations. There have been accidents befalling people who ask too many questions about his methods. Then innocent people will continue to die while a monster prospers," Nathan said quietly. "I've seen what Blackwood's greed has cost in human lives, Mr. Whitman. I've held dying children in my arms, watched women weep over husbands who were murdered for the crime of owning land that someone else wanted. If we don't stop him, who will?" The passion in Nathan's voice, the obvious sincerity of his commitment to justice, seemed to move Harold in ways that mere facts could not. "You really believe you can bring him down?" "I believe we have to try," Isabella said, reaching over to take Nathan's hand in full view of her shocked relatives. "Both of us together. This isn't just about justice for the people he's killed, it's about the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of future we want to build." Margaret gasped audibly at the obvious intimacy of the gesture, while Harold's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Isabella," he said slowly, "are you telling me that you and Mr. Blackhawk are? That is, your relationship is—" "I love him, Uncle Harold," Isabella said simply, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "I love him, and I choose to stand with him against whatever comes. I know that shocks you. I know it goes against everything you were raised to believe. But Nathan saved my life, and in doing so, he showed me what real honor looks like." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked as though she might faint, while Harold struggled visibly with emotions that ranged from shock to concern to something that might have been grudging admiration. "A white woman and an Apache warrior," he said finally, his voice thoughtful rather than condemnatory. "In any other city, such a relationship would be impossible. But San Francisco has always been different. Here, people are judged more by their character than their ancestry." "Then you'll help us?" Nathan asked, hope creeping into his carefully controlled voice. Harold was quiet for another long moment, his eyes moving between his niece and the man she had chosen to love. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll help you," he said. "Not just because I believe in your cause, but because I can see that Isabella has found something worth fighting for. And if my niece is willing to risk everything for justice and love, then the least I can do is stand beside her." The campaign against Cornelius Blackwood began that very evening, with Harold using his extensive network of business contacts to quietly gather information about the railroad baron's operations. What they discovered was even worse than they had imagined: a web of corruption that stretched from California to Washington, D.C., involving bribes, intimidation, and systematic violence against anyone who stood in the way of Blackwood's expansion plans. Over the following weeks, Isabella and Nathan worked tirelessly to build their case, gathering documentation and testimony from survivors of Blackwood's depredations. Nathan's knowledge of the Arizona attacks, combined with Isabella's understanding of business and finance, created a comprehensive picture of criminal activity that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. The breakthrough came when Harold's investigation uncovered financial records showing massive payments from Blackwood's accounts to known criminal organizations throughout the West. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning, particularly when combined with Nathan's eyewitness testimony about Morrison's final confession. "We have enough to destroy him," Harold announced during one of their evening strategy sessions. "The question is how to present it in a way that ensures maximum impact while protecting ourselves from retaliation." "Blackwood owns half the judges in California," Isabella pointed out. "If we go through official channels, he'll have warning and time to prepare his defenses." "Then we don't go through official channels," Nathan suggested, his warrior's mind turning to unconventional tactics. We take our evidence to the newspapers, to his business rivals, to anyone who has reasons to want him destroyed. We create a storm of public outrage that even his political protection can't weather. The plan they developed was audacious in its scope and devastating in its potential impact. Rather than filing formal charges through the compromised legal system, they would wage a campaign of public exposure that would turn Blackwood's own allies against him. Harold's business connections provided access to newspaper editors and rival railroad executives, while Nathan's knowledge of frontier violence gave their accusations the ring of authentic truth. The first article appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on a foggy Tuesday morning under the headline, "Railroad Baron's Reign of Terror Exposed." The story detailed Morrison's gang's attacks on frontier settlements, their connection to Blackwood's land acquisition schemes, and the systematic corruption that had protected them from justice. It was careful to present facts rather than accusations, but the implications were clear to anyone who read between the lines. Blackwood's response was swift and predictable. Within hours of the newspaper's publication, his lawyers were demanding retractions and threatening lawsuits. His political allies issued statements supporting his character and dismissing the allegations as the desperate lies of disgruntled business competitors. But the damage was already done. Other newspapers picked up the story, adding their own investigations and uncovering additional evidence of Blackwood's criminal activities. Business leaders who had been intimidated into silence found their courage renewed by the public exposure of their tormentor. Most importantly, federal investigators who had been blocked by political pressure suddenly found their superiors demanding immediate action. The final confrontation came exactly 1 month after their arrival in San Francisco. Cornelius Blackwood, cornered by mounting evidence and abandoned by his political protectors, agreed to meet with Harold Whitman in a desperate attempt to negotiate his way out of the scandal that threatened to destroy him. The meeting took place in Harold's office with Isabella and Nathan, hidden in an adjoining room where they could witness Blackwood's reaction to the evidence against him. When the railroad baron finally arrived, Isabella was shocked by his appearance, rather than the imposing figure she had expected. Blackwood was a small, unremarkable man whose power had always come from manipulation rather than personal charisma. "Whitman," Blackwood said, without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "I know you're behind these newspaper attacks. Name your price. What will it take to make this stop?" Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but implacable. "There is no price, Cornelius. What you've done is beyond forgiveness, beyond negotiation. The only question now is whether you'll face justice in a courtroom or at the end of a rope." Blackwood's composure finally cracked, revealing the vicious nature that had always lurked beneath his civilized facade. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he snarled. "I've destroyed better men than you, Whitman. I'll see you ruined, see your family destroyed. You'll see nothing," Nathan said, stepping through the connecting door with lethal grace. "Because your reign of terror ends here and now." Blackwood's face went white as he recognized the Apache warrior whose pursuit had ultimately led to his downfall. "You," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. "You're supposed to be dead. Morrison was supposed to—" "Morrison failed," Nathan said simply, "as did all your other hired killers. But their deaths served a purpose. They led us to you." The confession that followed was complete and damning. Faced with the evidence of his crimes and the knowledge that his enemies had survived every attempt to silence them, Blackwood broke down completely. He revealed the full scope of his operations, naming accomplices and detailing atrocities that went far beyond even Nathan's darkest suspicions. When federal marshals arrived to arrest him later that day, Cornelius Blackwood was a broken man, his empire in ruins and his crimes exposed to the world. The systematic corruption that had protected him for so long evaporated in the face of public outrage, leaving him defenseless against the justice he had avoided for so many years. As Isabella watched the man responsible for so much death and suffering being led away in chains, she felt a profound sense of completion. They had kept their promise to the innocent victims of Blackwood's greed, had ensured that justice would finally be served. "It's over," Nathan said quietly, his arm encircling her waist as they stood together in Harold's office. "The monster is caged, and his victims can finally rest in peace." "No," Isabella replied, turning to face the man she loved, with eyes bright with hope and determination. "It's not over, it's just beginning. We've proved that love can triumph over hatred, that justice can overcome corruption, that two people from different worlds can change the course of history itself." Nathan's smile was like the sunrise breaking over the Sierra Nevada mountains, brilliant, warming, and full of infinite promise. "Then what comes next, my beloved?" Isabella looked out at the bustling city of San Francisco, at the symbol of all that was possible in this land of dreams and second chances. "Next, we build the future we've been fighting for," she said, "together." The wedding took place 3 months later in Harold Whitman's garden, with guests drawn from every level of San Francisco society. It was a ceremony that would have been impossible anywhere else in America, but in the Golden City by the Bay, love had proven stronger than prejudice, and courage had overcome convention. As Isabella and Nathan exchanged vows beneath the California sun, they both knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead. There would be new challenges to face, new injustices to fight, new barriers to overcome, but they would meet them as they had met all their trials together, united by a love that had been forged in fire and tempered by adversity. In the years that followed, their story would become legend throughout the American West, the tale of a white woman and an Apache warrior who had found each other in the darkness and refused to let hatred tear them apart. It was a story of courage and conviction, of love and justice, of the unbreakable bonds that could form between two souls determined to make the world a better place. And in the golden hills of California, where dreams took root and flourished under the western sun, Isabella Blackhawk and her husband Nathan built a life that honored both their peoples while creating something entirely new, a legacy of hope that would inspire generations yet to come. The Crimson Desert had given birth to a love story for the ages, and its echoes would ring through eternity.